What is going on, YouTube universe? This is Zirra. Welcome back to my channel, ladies and gentlemen, where today we are going to discuss everything pertaining to the opening round of the AFL 2023 season, taking a bit of a deep dive into my tips, round 2 of the AFL 2023 season. But before we do so, there is still plenty of time for you to get on board both my footy tipping and super coach competitions. Link in the description of this video down below. Go and check it out. Both free to enter. Board, let's have some fun. But round 1 was one that was very interesting in the way of outcomes and how teams structured up. I personally had a very poor tipping round. I only tipped 4 out of 9. I'm currently second last in my tipping competition this week. Very woeful start. But there is a lot to talk about out of round 1, and in these videos from now on, I'm going to try to search for discussion points for us to have chats in the comments down below with certain things pertaining to either match outcome or changes to rules or interpretations and things like that. I think it's good for us to collectively collaborate and have a conversation about it, especially if you love AFL as much as I do. First point of discussion before we even dive into any outcomes from the weekend is the fact that crowds are back, ladies and gentlemen, and it is great to see. Except for if you tuned into the GWS versus Adelaide game and saw the 50-odd people sitting in the crowd. We're not going to even touch on that. But collectively, over the first round, we had 392,248 supporters enter a venue, sit down and watch the game live. That is huge, given that over the last couple of years, I still feel we've had people a little bit weary and anxious to get out to a live game because of COVID and restrictions and things that we've had, especially here in Melbourne. And I myself, 12 months ago, caught COVID going to the round 1 Richmond versus Carlton game. So it's still very much alive as a virus, and I can understand people not wanting to go, but it is so good to see people back. Out of that 392,000, 170,000 odd was off of the Richmond versus Carlton game and the Geelong versus Collingwood game in the opening first 2 rounds. Huge showing from all of those clubs in the first 2 games. It's just, as someone who loves AFL, and I, as much as I'm one-eyed Richmond, I watch every single game every weekend. I am more than just a Richmond supporter. I'm an AFL supporter. I'm a true AFL fan, and I get enjoyment out of watching every single game. Even the AFLW, I'll sit down and watch every single game. It's just, I've grown up in such a rich football culture that I just can't get enough. And the off-season, such a boring period for myself, and it is so good to have football back. A little bit terrible when you tip as bad as I did. The opening game saw Richmond take on Carlton at the MCG, and it finished in a draw. In a game that Richmond probably should have won, and in a game that Carlton had plenty of opportunity to win late. Harry Mackay missed some regulation shots he normally wouldn't miss. Richmond had a couple of out on the fools. Shai Bolton dead in front, missed. Lynch, with ice in his veins, kicked the goal to tie the game with less than 20 seconds left on the clock, and Blake Acres drops an uncontested mark in the dying moments, which would have seen a potential shot on goal. Now, I've seen Blake Acres kick. He probably wouldn't have kicked the goal, but if they've gotten a fist to it and got it through for a behind, that's all they would have needed. So, pressure mounted at the end of that game. And as much as I loved the tackling intensity, and I can rattle off a number of names of Richmond players like Daniel Rioli and Tim Taranto. Lewis Young from Carlton was really impressive. It was the least skilled game over the whole weekend, and a lot of people have been coming out saying it was an embarrassing game to watch. Richmond versus Carlton should open up the season. I know that's a lot of anti-Richmond and a lot of anti-Carlton supporters saying that, but I'm of the belief that you don't need a high-scoring game to enjoy a game of football. It was the lowest scoring game collectively over the weekend, yes. The entries inside 50 on both ends were pretty woeful. I mean, Richmond had the ball inside 50 odd times and could only kick, a handful of goals. It was poor on that front. I'll give you that. But I still found enjoyment in watching the game. A lot of Carlton fans would have found enjoyment. I thought the thrill of the final 2 minutes, seeing the game really on the line, and then Richmond tying it up, and then still being enough time for a team to win, because we've seen Richmond fumble a lead or a draw in dying moments like that in the past. Carlton probably wish David Mundy was on their list in those dying moments, but both teams walk away with a draw. At the end of the day, probably a fitting result, given there was not a definitive leader. Would have I preferred 4 points? Absolutely I would have, but to walk away with 2 points in a game that either team could have lost, I'll take it. The discussion point to come out of this particular game is one that I saw posed by the Hoops Show on Twitter, which is an AFL YouTube channel, so feel free to go check them out. They are Geelong orientated, so for the Cats fans, definitely one you want to get on board with. But they were on Twitter posing the question of how should the AFL handle the draws, and as supporters, how do we feel about draws and how should draws be handled? And we know with the finals and the grand final, especially the grand final, it used to be the fact that if there was a draw, we would come back the following week and replay the entire game from start to finish to find a definitive winner. Now we get extra time and we get a couple of quarters to try and work shit out. With the finals, we obviously need a winner, so it makes sense that we get extra time. In a regulation season, though, we don't need a winner, so obviously they're happy to just give 2 points either way and we move on. But I want to pose the question and open up discussion to you guys. How do you guys feel in a regulation AFL season should draws be handled? Are you happy to see 2 points either way? Would you rather extra time? Would you rather something like a golden goal? I think it's a great discussion to have, so let's get it going in the comments down below. Let me know your thoughts. Friday night saw Geelong go down to Collingwood at the MCG in a game where I tipped Geelong. I thought they were going to get over the line. And at halftime, I thought they were going to. They kicked 12 goals, 1 for the opening half. Incredibly accurate. But it was a tale of a different team in the second half. Collingwood came out and kicked 10 goals to 4 and just got on a hot run. I think they kicked 8 unanswered goals, I think, from memory. And they just looked so good, Collingwood. Very impressive around the contest. They were bullying Geelong around the ball. And I don't know what happened to Geelong. I don't know whether it was complacency. I don't know whether Collingwood just weren't themselves in the first half and really got going at half time. Whatever the case may be, Collingwood was vastly superior in a game that you probably could have gone 50-50 either way. But Geelong, the biggest worry for them now is the fact that they've lost Tom Stewart for at least a month due to injury. Scott's already come out in the post-game press conference talking about the surface of the MCG after the Ed Sheeran concert has deteriorated, and obviously with the changing of all the grass and everything else, that it's opened up opportunity for players to get more easily injured because it's a different surface, and it's a bit of a shit show with all the conversation that's been going on. But Collingwood not only doing my tips dirty, but coming out with a very strong showing in their first game of the year. Collingwood as well didn't get out of the game unscathed. Jeremy Howe horrendously breaking his arm on camera, and I saw the arm. I'm not going to show it. You can go find it yourself. The commentators even shied away from wanting to show it again on screen during the game. But put it this way. You've got your forearm here. It looked like there was a secondary elbow right here because it was sticking upward. Jeremy Howe, he's going to be out for a few months. It was very saddening to see because he's a true warrior for Collingwood. But it's kind of a sour note to their win. A lot of Collingwood supporters and Collingwood themselves happy they got up, but very disheartened to see such a battler go down. Saturday kicked off at Marvel with North Melbourne taking on West Coast. I jokingly, in my round 1 tips, turned around and said this was going to be a blockbuster because it was the last 2 teams from last year's season. It turned out to be a blockbuster of a game. North Melbourne getting the win by 5 points against a very fast finishing West Coast. West Coast could have upset here. The door was wide open for them to do so. North Melbourne started off incredibly hot, but then started dying off later in the game. I don't know whether that's going to be a common trend for us to see through the year, with North maybe getting an early jump, but then still not being strong enough in their structure to kind of follow through all game. They did lose Christian Cherry early, their ruckman, and they did go into this game without Todd Goldstein, so you could probably argue that on that front they faltered a bit, and that could have opened the door for West Coast to come back in. But young Harry Sheasel, the draftee that went to North Melbourne in last year's AFL draft, came out and got the NAB Rising Star nomination, is the first debutant, round one debutant since 1991, I think it was, that has had over 30 possessions in a game of football. All the talk has been about Will Ashcroft winning the Rising Star, and I myself said I felt that he already had one hand on that award. Sheasel is going to give it a real shake-up. This kid looks incredibly impressive. Down at Adelaide, we had Port Adelaide taking on Brisbane, where I said I thought Brisbane were going to come out and win because Port Adelaide had been very poor in the pre-season. It looks like they were saving their stocks for round one, because Port Adelaide came out and demoralised Brisbane. They put their foot down on the throat and did not hold back. 126 defeated 72. Holy shit. And it was off the back of Port's youngsters, Connor Rosey, Zach Butters, Jason Horne-Francis, who left North Melbourne last year and had it probably, in my eyes, a very poor season because we know he can deliver more, and came out and put on a best on ground performance in his first game for Port Adelaide, showing us what he is truly capable of. And I think a lot of that plays into the fact that he's gone home, he's more happier, he looks like a different player and a different person too, but Port Adelaide were just so damaging moving the ball around the ground. But it was the players that have come into the club, Junior Rioli, Jason Horne-Francis, these types of players that have come from clubs that haven't really seen success, and they've come in here and they've added such a dynamic to this team already. I feel I've misjudged Port Adelaide a hell of a lot. If they can keep up this brand of football, and I know it's only round one, so, you know, we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves when making judgments, but they looked so good based off of one game that I reckon they could even push top four this year if they can find consistency. They looked really good. And this is where the discussion point comes in, that, you know, media outlets shouldn't be boasting silly headlines during the preseason, because Port Adelaide had been written off completely. Brisbane belted Geelong in a preseason game and they were getting touted as premiership favourites, and now they come out and absolutely get demoralised by Port. So I think preseason wise, we just need to take a step back. We need to just take it for what it is. We shouldn't be getting ahead of ourselves. Now that we're in round one, we can start making assumptions, but it is still early. But I feel before the season proper even starts, we shouldn't be throwing premiership favourite, or, you know, this team's not going to win any games or anything else. Like, we can make interpretations and we can have opinions, but media personalities that have real influence should maybe scale it back a bit. That's all I'm saying, because we've got two teams that have been on polar opposites of the discussion all preseason and have come out and done the complete fucking opposite of what everybody's been saying. Melbourne took on the Bulldogs, and we saw a similar outcome to what we saw in that grand final only a couple of years ago. Melbourne coming out after half-time, putting the foot down and running away with the game, as I expected they would, but I didn't think they would win this emphatically. And the combination of Gawn and Grundy just worked so incredibly well. But there is a sour note to this point, and it is the fact that Kozzy Pickett has brought up a lot of discussion this coming weekend. We have had 3 players total over the weekend suspended or front the tribunal for a hip and shoulder. Lance Franklin from Sydney, hip and shoulders Sam Collins in the head, only gets 1 week and can cuss the bloke. I think that was incredibly fucking soft. Kozzy Pickett launches off the ground and torpedoes himself into Bailey Smith, who gets straight back up and plays out the rest of the game, respectively. Okay, good on him for getting back up after that hit too. But Kozzy Pickett only gets 2 weeks when Shane McAdams from Adelaide performs the exact same hit, results in a concussion, and he is now fronting the tribunal for at least 3 weeks minimum. Now, 1, the MRO either has a fucking spin the wheel where they spin to decide the outcome of a hit, because 1 week for a blatant hit in the head that knocks a guy out is bullshit. Cozzy Pickett and McAdams both hitting a bloke at the exact same velocity. You'd probably argue Cozzy's might have been worse considering he left the ground. One gets concussed, one doesn't, and they decide, you know, penalty based on injury, which I think is crap. I reckon you need to set a borderline and then you tack on additional weeks for the injury. So it should be 2 to 3 weeks for the hit, depending on severity, which I think Cozzy Pickett should have copped at least 3 weeks. You could then argue the same for Shane McAdam, but because Shane McAdams hit concussed a bloke, you then go, okay, here's 3 weeks, but now we look at the severity of the hit in the way of the injury that was sustained, and we give X amount of weeks on top. That's just how I feel. Scott Pendlebury has come out during the week, however, and has suggested that the AFL look to the NRL and bring in a sin bin where the player gets sent off for 10 to 15 minutes for doing an act like that and disadvantages the team that player represents. So in that period of time, Cozzy Pickett has elected to take a player out of the game. He then gets sin binned 10 to 15 minutes. Then it becomes a 17 versus 18, so that respectively now gives Bulldogs the chance to come back off of the back of a ill decision, an ill-directed hit from a Melbourne player. And I think it is probably something we should look at. I feel there has been plenty of instances over the course of the last couple of years. You can look at Tom Stewart taking Dion Prestia out last season. You can argue the hits that we've seen this year, you know, punches off the ball and everything else. Send a player off for 10 to 15 minutes. If it's bad enough, you can book them for a report or whatever else. But let's have a discussion about it as well. In the comments down below, do you think the AFL should incorporate a sin bin for dirty acts? The final 4 games of the round, I only tipped 1 out of 4, so Sunday wasn't a good day for me. It really wasn't. But Sydney came out and absolutely destroyed the Gold Coast, and I wonder whether the loss in the grand final last year was the fork in the road for Sydney, the kick up the arse they really needed, or are they just flat track bullies and they're going to bully teams during the season proper, and then when it comes to the finals they're going to fall short of the mark? I don't know. They did look good though. GWS defeated Adelaide in a game where I tipped Adelaide on the back of saying I thought Adelaide was going to have a real up and coming year, and GWS proved me wrong. A lot of doubt has been put on GWS, even from myself, with all the losses they had in Taranto and Hawthorne and Hill, but they found a way. They dug deep, and players like Caniglio, Green, both Greens, really stood up in a game where they were down to 1 rotation. They had a lot of HIA protocol, you know, going down with players with concussion, and Perryman went down with a hamstring. As Adam Kingsley said post-game, it was one of the most courageous wins he has ever been involved with, and I really take my hat off to GWS for getting the job done. Essendon demoralised Hawthorne, and Hawthorne started really hot, and I thought, yes, Hawthorne are going to get the upset that I tipped, and then Essendon came back, and just like Port Adelaide did to Brisbane, Essendon put their foot on the throat of Hawthorne and didn't give up, and Essendon are on top of the ladder after round 1. It fucking breaks my heart because all my Essendon supporting friends have been fucking giving it to me all weekend. And the final game of the round, St Kilda got up in a game where everybody probably tipped against them. Fremantle are in all sorts. I don't know. They had, again, just like Richmond, 60-odd inside 50s. Fife's worst game ever. Ever. I don't know what the fuck they're going to do with Fife. He is not a forward. He probably doesn't fit into their midfield mix anymore. I really don't know where he stands and what he's going to do, but Fremantle need to turn their shit around. So as I said, I only got 4 out of 9, but Gramercy Riff 78 in my tipping competition managed to get 7 out of 9, tipping the most correct for round 1. So congratulations, sir, for getting it done better than anybody else for the opening round. So, after round 1, this right here is how the AFL ladder is shaping up. We have Essendon sitting on top, with Sydney, Melbourne and Port Adelaide rounding out the top 4, followed by St Kilda, Collingwood, GWS and North Melbourne rounding out the top 8. Carlton and Richmond sitting tied for 9th with 2 points respectively from the draw. We then have West Coast, Adelaide, Geelong and Fremantle, with the bottom 4 currently being Brisbane, Bulldogs, Gold Coast and Hawthorne. Now that we've had time to discuss round 1 and talk about how poorly my tips have gone and pose some discussion points for you guys in the comments, let's quickly go through round 2 and see how it's going to go down. Thursday night, again, Carlton, back-to-back weeks on a Thursday night. We have Carlton taking on Geelong at the MCG. I'm going to tip Geelong. I don't think they lose 2 games in a row. I think they do this by 26 points. But, that being said, no Tom Stewart in this defensive lineup opens the door for either Harry Mackay or Charlie Curnow, whichever one is going to get the lesser defender, to really step up here. Because I feel Carlton has an engine room that can topple Geelong's engine room. It's now going to be a battle of the tall timber up either end. You're going to have Charlie Curnow, Harry Mackay up one end, Tom Hawkins, Jeremy Cameron up the other. But I feel then when you look at the fleet around them, Geelong's forward line are more potent with the Gary Rowan, Brian Myers, you know, those type of players all coming through. Brad Close, half it even. Whereas I know you've got the smaller players like a Motlop and a Fisher down at Carlton. I just feel the battle in the midfield is going to be won by the Blues, marginally. But it's then defensive structures. How are we going to shape up? I feel Carlton might be a little bit better defensively than Geelong, but it's just something about Geelong here, even though I'm almost talking myself into saying Carlton's going to win. I think Geelong don't take 2 losses back-to-back. I think they bounce back here quite emphatically. Friday night at the Gabba, Melbourne, Brisbane. I've got to go Melbourne here. Even though Brisbane are back on their home turf, Melbourne looked vastly superior against the Bulldogs, and I feel you don't play that well and then drop off the mark. And I know Brisbane, back at home, they're going to be a lot more comfortable. I really think now Melbourne are shaping up firm to get a really strong stranglehold on this competition early. Even though I backed Brisbane for the premiership and to finish on top of the ladder overall this year, I don't know. I just didn't like how they operated last week. There's going to be a lot of resetting and rejigging, and you could probably argue the same for Brisbane that I've just argued for Geelong. They're not going to take those back-to-back losses. I just feel Melbourne are going to ruck up and do a little bit of damage. Saturday afternoon at the MCG, we've got Collingwood taking on Port Adelaide. I am going to back Collingwood here. This is going to be, for me, game of the round, because we have 2 teams that took down very strong competition quite convincingly, and if Port Adelaide can rock up to the MCG on Saturday afternoon and do in Collingwood, they're going to prove a lot of naysayers wrong. I just feel Collingwood are going to be too strong to beat at home. Later on that afternoon at Adelaide Oval, we have Adelaide taking on Richmond. Adelaide licking their wounds from defeat against GWS in a game that they had really good, strong maintenance on. They had this game in the palm of their hand for so long and let it slip. Richmond obviously bouncing off of the draw. I'm going to go Richmond. Last couple of seasons against Adelaide, we've either been beaten or we've only just won. And, you know, Adelaide, I feel, can give this game a real shake. I wouldn't be surprised if Richmond dropped the ball on this one. But I feel for a game that we drew, and as I said, Richmond probably should have won that game. Stat-wise, we definitely did. If Richmond just do a little bit of restructuring, I think we've got the perfect makeup, and I think we bounce back with a win. Saturday afternoon sees the Bulldogs taking on St Kilda, and I'm going to back in the Bulldogs here, but Ross Lyon coming back to the club and building such a defensive structural presence at St Kilda, even though the Bulldogs have a better team on paper, Fremantle have a better team on paper, and St Kilda still dug deep and found a way. This is a danger game for the Bulldogs, because I don't think you want to lose 2 games at the start of the year back-to-back, especially against one team that has their star forwards missing, and this is a game that'll go begging if the Bulldogs drop it. I don't think they fumble this one, but I can envision a future, a different time zone, a different fucking dimension, whatever you want to call it, where St Kilda get up and upset here. Optus Stadium, Fremantle taking on North Melbourne. I don't think North Melbourne are going to travel well against Fremantle. Fremantle back at home are going to be comfortable, good to reset, and they're going to get a win. I think it's that simple, really. Sydney versus Hawthorne at the SCG. I think Sydney's going to get this one done quite convincingly. Hawthorne to win the wooden spoon at this point in time is almost a lock for me early. Sunday at Marvel Stadium, Essendon taking on the Gold Coast. I hate to say this, but Essendon's probably going to be still in the top 4 after the first 2 rounds. Who would have thunk it? And Optus Stadium, West Coast taking on GWS. I'm going to go GWS because West Coast, if you look at it statistically over the last couple of seasons, have become the easiest team to beat, and I feel a lot of people gave West Coast an easy ride last year because of all the happenings with COVID, and we saw so many iterations of that team with players that don't play at AFL level and everything else. But let's take that out of the equation. This is a team that won a grand final only a few years back. They have then since become one of the easiest teams to beat in the competition. I can't get my head around that because they still have some quality talent on the top end. They've got some great young kids coming through the system. I don't know what the fuck's going on. I really do not. So reflecting over my tips for round 2, we have gone with Geelong, Melbourne, Collingwood, Richmond, Bulldogs, Fremantle, Sydney, Essendon, and GWS. Be sure, ladies and gentlemen, to let me know your tips in the comments down below. Don't forget to have a discussion with me down below with my discussion points for this video as well. Should the AFL introduce a sin bin for reportable or, offences that are going to see players copped by the MRO? Should we have anything in place for a draw, or should we still just go 2 points either way? Let's start talking about this stuff. I really like the idea of these videos opening up discussion points for us to have at home. Do leave a like on the video if you enjoyed. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you're new around here as well. But that's it from me, guys. I'm out of here. Good luck to your teams this weekend. And as always, I will catch you guys next time.